So, welcome to today's meeting. Today we're talking about the parish of KILTEARN in the north of Ross and Cromarty. The research has been done by my sister Helen Gentle, who you've probably met from some of these earlier meetings. And it's going to be an exciting parish. It's quite different to some of the others we've looked at, although it's close to Olness that we looked at last year. And I think we'll see some variation as we've seen in all these sessions here today. I have to say that Helen's had a challenging job because whereas some of these old statistical accounts are only about 4 or 5 pages long, her one was 29 pages of closely typed and thoughtfully researched work. So she herself has had quite a challenge to use this material to prepare today's meeting. Next slide. So, as we've done previously, we're going to look at the location of this particular parish and what we find there, you know, the topography, how big it is, what sort of things they're able to produce there as a form of income for the parish, who the main people, leaders are of that community, the numbers of people, their employment opportunities, how many poor there are, housing, diet, these sorts of things. And, you know, so we're going to look at a number of aspects of this parish and what it was like. We're trying to focus on what it was like as being an ordinary person living in this parish in the 1790s. And we're going to use the statistical account to do that. Over to you, Helen.
Sorry, we've been doing this a few times, so I preempted you, Bruce. Hi, everybody. It's quite exciting to Bruce gave me the KILTEARN Parish because he, my brother Don, and I all have a great-great-grandmother who was actually born here. So it brings extra knowledge to our family background. Where we're looking at is within the Ross and Cromarty area. And this is, if you look at the map on the right there, it's Scotland, and you've got all the red areas of Ross and Cromarty, so quite extensive. What we're looking at is Easter Ross, which is this section here. So here's a blown up version of Easter Ross. We have the Cromarty Firth going in here, and we have the other Firth going into Inverness, the Murray Firth. If you look, there's Allness Parish, and here we have this boot shape. It's almost like Italy. This is KILTEARN. Now, KILTEARN Parish sits on the coast and goes a long way inland. So it sits on the banks and is next to Allness, and the two of them together form what's called the Ferren Donald. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. KILTEARN was named Kil and Terran. Now, I don't speak Gaelic, but it's okay because most of you probably don't either. It means the burial ground of a great man, but there's some conjecture of who this great man was because the Monroes of Fowles, who are the main heritors here, weren't buried there until 1588, so clearly wasn't after them. So here's another map of our Italy style thing. Now we've got the mountain here, which is Ben Wyvis, and Ben Wyvis is called the Hill of Terror. I'm not sure why either. I think that's a fascinating bit of information. It's 1,046 meters high. So it goes 10 kilometers along the coast here of the shore, with the agricultural land basically on the shoreline and then gradually sloping up to the mountain. Another map of it. Allness next door in this particular map has a lot more forests than we do in KILTEARN Parish, but what we're looking at mainly here is the waterways. Now this loch glass here is a huge loch, and a fellow last night was saying that it was actually the water supply for a very large area of this whole section of the Ross and Cromarty area. So I hadn't actually gleaned that from any of my research, so it's great to get some local knowledge, especially from someone who's also a McLennan. So the water goes down here, down what's called the River Glass these days, but it was called the Alt Grad, which meant the ugly river. Great name. There's lots of other little lochans up here in the hills, and when the snow melts, it floods down this river. The other main river is the Skiack, and the Skiack goes along here, and both of them end up going into the Firth really close together. It's quite interesting how closely they are, so I presume that's the flooding land. The old church is just next to the Skiack River here. The castle of the Monroes is here, Fowles Castle. Their grain store is sitting here on the coast. We have Sawdale, which we'll talk about later here. And we have Evanton, which is a town that was built just after our OSA was written. At the time, there was this little town village called Drummond, which was very small. and that was the only really sort of established village at all within the parish. So purely farming ground in this area. So now we have here another map that's a modern one, but it's showing you the more extensive forests that actually exist today and were starting to be built, planted during our period. You've got all the agricultural land down the bottom here, and you've got Everton sitting here. Currently, the A9 road goes down from Tane all the way through and crosses to the Black Isle, which is this area opposite them, and heads on to Inverness there. During the time the OSA was written, the coach went straight through and went to Dingle this way and had to go all the way around the end of the Firth before it could go down. So, but at least they had a coach going through, and that's important to this whole district. The population. At the time of our OSA, there was 1,661 people living in KILTEARN Parish. 694 of them were males, but 922 of them were females. And somebody from, I think it was Melbourne, said yesterday morning that it's interesting that that's probably why people were moving in, because there was all these females there and no males to grab them. So, interesting concept. The 448 of the population, that's over a quarter, are under 10 years old. Now, what had happened was the population had dropped massively between 1740 and 1770 due to the many wars that were happening, and the Munros were more than happy to sign up their people to march off to war at the slightest excuse. The minister refers to it as that the place was long a nursery for the army, which is a pretty sad indictment, I think. After the peace, the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the men started returning, but you had a significant number of widows left because obviously a lot didn't return. And there was a lot of new work started happening there, and you'll find out why later. But so there was new building work and new road work, and so more than had left came in because there was work available. There's 153 unmarried women between 20 and 50 years of age, but only 72. Big differential. 96 widows, as I said, but only 15 widowers. He says that they are quite long-lived, actually. We've had people live right up to 117 years old. So as tough as life was, made them hardy. This is a modern map showing the topography of satellite. It's much the same as it was then, that all the area that was under cultivation is down by the seashore. So we have Fowles Castle here, and the grain house is down here. Little Drummond, the village, here. The old church and the ancient burial ground are sitting in this spot. Now, remember, Everton didn't exist then, but it was built in 1806, so just after. And this is Everton Wood that was also built just after. And we have the Alt Grad going through here. Now, remember Black Rock Gorge, because that's where it's going to be. You'll find out about that later. There's some usable land up here as well. And this is Clare, and this is actually where our great-great-grandmother was born, in Clare. It says that there's grazing all the way 15 kilometres all the way up the hill, and this was well cultivated. And what I liked that it had stone walls and thorn hedges. So I've driven past here, but I didn't realise the significance of the place, so I haven't actually investigated it in detail. I will one day again. This is just giving you an overview from the mountain, down past the forest, past Everton, and the productive land, and down to the Cromarty Firth at the bottom of it. Now, the soil varies hugely. It's sandy and gravelly all the way along the very edge, and there's some shell marl, which they don't use for improving soils. There's then heavy dark soil, and then there's red clay soil. He says that there's some coal somewhere, but they didn't bother. They only dug 3 holes and said, nah, it's not worth digging up. And the minister felt that perhaps they should have put more effort into it. He's obviously a pre-Victorian, isn't he? I missed something there. Oh, the 2/3 of the parish belong to Hugh Munro, so a whole 2/3, which is a significant quantity. The produce of this parish is not dissimilar to most Highland areas, so your oats and barley are your main crops, but he says that they actually had very poor yields. Very little left over for market. And because there was no mill locally, they didn't grow much flax and wheat. And he says that the increased rainfall over the previous 20 years further reduced the yields. He's very quizzical about the next line. He says that the Black Isle opposite produces much more, and it also produces earlier. So a good fortnight earlier, they're harvesting on the Black Isle, and yet the Black Isle, and you Northern Hemisphere people would understand this, it's facing north, so it's not getting the sun, whereas Kiltearn is facing south. To us, that's the wrong way around. But so even though they've got a sunnier aspect, they clearly don't have the decent soil, or they're not putting the effort into improving the soil. Here we have the grain house. It's also called a gurnal. It's also called the rent house down by the shores. It's currently a museum of the Monroe family, and there's a lot of interesting information in there that I've found from their online site. It's also a replica of a ferryman's cottage there. And this is where the tenants sent their grain for payment, and it's also where they received payment of grain from the landlords as well. So it's very important in the area, this place. They ship the grains out to Leith, which is the port of Edinburgh, and London from there. Also, you have Loch Glass, and Loch Glass, as we saw, was very large, and lots of little lochans, and there's apparently an abundance of trout and ducks and geese there, possibly only accessible for the landed gentry and their friends, not the everyday people. Now, we're interested in what our folks ate. What they did was they, down by the seashore, they built these things called yares. And this is actually in the Murray Firth, but it's an example of sort of fish traps people built. They could be either stone or timber, or they could simply be just digging holes deeply and piling the sand up. So the tide comes in, the fish get caught behind it, and they grab the fish. And this is a technique that, and there's another one over here, this is the technique that Aboriginal Australians had been using for tens of thousands of years. So very traditional way of catching fish. They also use cobbles, which apparently are wide boats with nets. They call that still fishing. And they caught flounder and herring fry and salmon and sprats. They were also able to pick up shellfish on the shore, so mussels, cockles and whelks. So our ancestors would have had the opportunity to get fresh food if they were able to get there and had time to do it, and seasonally adjusted, obviously. He says there was a distillery at Upper Balcony that consumes, it says there, 180 bowls of barley. And he says that the was all consumed within the parish. Now, I'm not sure if that meant there was a lot produced, or they drank a lot, or which way around it was, but he decried the fact that they didn't sell any of it. They just got rid of it all down their own throats, apparently. He says that there's 2 licensed ale houses, and these are ones that paid excise to the government, but numerous blind whiskey houses, and people spent long hours in these places, which were really just back of someone's house in a back lane, illegal. And people would just while their time away there, and he saw this as a great evil, and felt that the justices of the peace should be actually following through and making sure that they did something about this. Now, on the other side of the river, the old Grad from the distillery, is this KILTEARN bleach field. It's the only one in the county. And he says country, but I don't know if that's a misprint or what, but it has to be county rather than country. So by 1790, it was becoming quite a good business. It had been going for a while, but they had a new manager, and he apparently was very successful. And they were so impressed that they built a drying house, and they were building him a fancy house to live in. And you'll later realise how unusual that is in this parish. I was really surprised by this. I'd never heard of bleach fields. Bruce tells me that one of our relatives had been doing this in Glasgow as well. So we believe that it's linen that they're lying down on the grass and allowing it to bleach, which really surprises me as someone from sunny Australia, that Scotland would have enough sunlight to actually bleach fabric, but apparently it worked. Livestock. Now, we've looked at this in all the various parishes, and it's interesting to compare them, isn't it? In Kiltearn, there's 1,000 black cattle. And there are varying styles. The poorer farmers have quite small black cattle, whereas the gentleman farmers were actually purchasing better quality in more recent years. So there was a massive improvement in what was happening. And these were actually herded by walking to Bewley, which, as you know, is some distance away. So that was their nearest big market. They had only 600 sheep, and he says they were inferior sheep. They gave very little wool, and they were not encouraged because they were destroying the new plantations that they were trying to grow. So nobody was being pushed out by sheep farming in Kiltearn. The minister comments that up until very recently, they were really reluctant to eat pork. But since they've overcome this problem, they all keep at least one or two and some often a half a dozen pigs, in order to get a bit of extra money on the side, because they would just sell those at market rather than eating them. The massive number of horses. Now, we've only got 1,600 people living in the parish, and we have 308 of these little Highland Garrans, which are gorgeous little horses, obviously sturdy, so they manage the rough terrain, plus 60 Galloway horses for ploughing and carting. They're enormous, gorgeous things. Look at them compared with this fellow here. Now, as to agricultural improvements, the gentleman farmers were actually employing managers from southern Scotland, so from East Lothian and Fife, and they were bringing with them the more modern ideas of how to farm. And so they'd purchased the larger cattle, as I said, from Fife and Murray, and they'd planted clover and rye, but they also wanted to enclose their farms, and the poorer tenants did not want this to happen because the minister says they were shocking farmers, and so they would just destroy their own land and wanted to use the common ground. And these modern farmers were saying, no, 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 we don't share the modern farm, that we enclose. That's the way to farm these days. Recently, this is a view from the Black Isle across the Cromarty Firth to Kiltearn. You've got Ben Withers for the snow. Now, just back from here is the black soil, and they'd recently taken up draining this, so digging drainage and improving it, and apparently their output was significantly better because of that. But they don't seem to have used any of the shell marl, which is available there to improve the soil, and they can't use seaweed because it's just sandy shore, there is no seaweed. He talks about a modern innovation of combining the horses and the oxen together to pull together, and this was far more successful. He says that the poorer farmers just put anything together. They'll have a horse and a cow and an ox together and just see what happens, and it's most unsuccessful. He's a very educated person, this Reverend Harry Robertson, and he notes things in detail. As Bruce said, a lot of pages of data here. And he noticed that they were harnessing the oxen like horses, and they designed a new strap and buckle system to prevent injury from the ox's horns. And this, he said, was an amazing new innovation. So I just think his eye for all the detail in this parish is incredible. Early in the 18th century, there were very few forest trees, but they obviously started looking around their district further and said, forest's probably the way to go. So from the 1790s on, the various heritors started extensive plantings, and they were actually trying to outcompete each other to see who had the best forest. Harry Robertson felt that through forestry, they could probably double the parish income. Sadly, in the very year that the OSA was written in 1791, 6,000 of the trees on Fowles Estate were lost in high winds. That's a huge setback. And as I said, the sheep are unpopular because they trample the young trees. Alexander Fraser, who later buys part of the land there, replants some Everton wood here only 10 years later. And so here's Everton wood with some timber getters, obviously more recently because it's a photograph. I found it very interesting to compare the transport available in this parish with the others that we've heard the talks on. There seems to be a wide variety of transport here. The minister says that there's 10 open wagons and there's 30 box carts drawn by 2 horses for the proprietors and principal farmers. And this is double what it was in 20 years ago. So big changes have happened. There's 100 various ploughs, and I can't remember who gave us a description earlier of a plough, but it's the one thing the minister doesn't discuss, what these 100 ploughs look like. He does mention, though, that they have these things called killikis, which are little carts that have these tumble wheels, and they use these carts. So there's a lot of these around, and they use them for moving the corn and the peat and manure, and that's the only mention of any soil improvement. They're actually carting the manure to go on there. He comments that the roads and bridges are very well maintained, and he says that they're actually maintained by free labour, as opposed to conscripted labour, as in felons who are working their time on the road rather than in prison, which was probably pretty common in the 1790s. Me coming from a country where they ship people out who wouldn't do things like that. So, they'd recently built a new bridge over the Altgrad River, and the Fowles Castle had just recently removed the road to further south so that they could actually have a wonderful view of the castle as people drove past, which must be great for the people, mustn't it, to see the castle. Our relatives, I would imagine, though, were more likely to have walked. And so walking would have been a very common thing. You know, they're walking the cattle and the pigs all the way to Bewley. They're walking to see their relatives in other parts of the whole district of Ross. Walking is significant. What's unusual about this one is that it has this post, the mail cart truck goes through, mail coach goes through from Dingwall to Nova Inn, and it stops at Drummond, which is the village in the parish. It's actually part of the run all the way from Inverness through to Tain. So a significant thing to have something like that. They also had 3 harbours. Now, this is a view of where a harbour was. Now, there's no mention of why it's a harbour. I presume there must have been a wharf built of some sort, because they were actually able to load boats with 100 tonne of goods. So it has to be more than just this. But there is mention later, though, that they were still using into the early 20th century small boats to actually beach them in high tide, load and unload, and then push them off again at low tide. But where they were going was simply down the water to Cromarty. And Cromarty has a pier that was built only 6 years earlier in 1785. George Ross bought the Cromarty estate, and he approached the British government to give some money towards him building this pier. So they gave £7,000, which is a huge amount of money, to build this pier. And there was once fortnightly boats going to London and to Leith from there. So Kiltearn had very easy access to the outside world from there. The heritors of the parish are the Munros of Fowles. They'd been there since the 11th century, when King Malcolm II gave the land of Kiltearn and Allness to a Donald Munro, and they called the land Ferren Donald, which means the land of Donald. And because they were so closely tied with the crown, obviously, they stayed fiercely loyal for all times. You'll find to their detriment later. So this is the modern view of the castle from the air. So it's been the Munro, this castle had been the Munro seat since the 14th century, and the oldest tower was 1154. It was sacked by the Jacobite Mackenzies, and that's our crowd. We're connected with the Mackenzies. After Sir Robert, the 6th Baronet, was killed at Falkirk Muir in 1746. And when he was killed, his son, Sir Harry, was in prison at Glamis Castle because he'd been grabbed at Prestapans. So poor Sir Harry ends up inheriting a ruined castle. When they rebuilt it, they built it as a Georgian mansion because it no longer needed fortification, because this is now post-Culloden. And they have left some bits. So this is part of the old fortifications. It's a gun loop in the old building. So here we have the 2 heritors that affect our period. We have Sir Harry here, fine-looking fellow. Now he was I mentioned the numbers. The minister calls him the 28th Baronet, but the Munro clan site calls him the 7th because there's a different way of numbering. So hard to know which one to call him. He was a scholar that spent 20 years preparing a book that was not published before he died. And he came home, didn't miss Culloden completely because he was busy trying to work out what had happened when he inherits a ruined castle. So he started the rebuild of the castle. and then his son Hugh took over. Now Harry here started the Monroe Independent Company to continue policing after Culloden, so till 1748, so significantly pro-government. So Hugh, his son, took over the rebuilding, but he didn't come and live there, and he wasn't there during the time that the OSA was written. He was living in London with his wife Jane and his illegitimate daughter Mary. And interestingly, he spent many, many years fighting legal battles to prove that Mary was the legal heir of the property. And she died just after him. So the line ended at that point, and a distant cousin Charles inherited the property. I do like their dread God. I think that's fantastic. Interesting connection with Black Watch here, and I wore Black Watch to school. So, so did Bruce's daughter Anna, actually. So after 1715, the 1715 Jacobite rebellion, independent companies and militia were raised for policing and peacekeeping. The Monroes were one of the founding clans, and it was known as the Black Watch because it was very unpopular, and because of their tartan being ostensibly black. The Black Watch is the Monroe hunting tartan today. This connection with the martial pursuits resulted in a large number of young men signing up, going overseas, dying, lots of widows, the castle being burnt down, and then the rebuild. So the fact that they were so military is significant. There were 6 heritors in KILTEARN Parish, but only 2 of them were full-time residents. As we've heard, Sir Hugh was only part-time. This slide shows Sawdale, and Sawdale was one of the 3 main residences of the Monroe family. It's radically changed today, but apparently if you want to go and stay in KILTEARN, it's available as a B&B. And the third one, so we've got the Monroe Castle, we've got Sawdale, and we had Balcony Castle. Balcony Castle was over near Alness boundary. And it was a Monroe residence from the 15th to the 17th century. But it was bought by a sugar plantation owner called Alexander Fraser in 1806. And he built the village of Everton that was spoken about before. There was a planned village nearby, and he planted the wood. It was used as a Royal Naval Air Base during World War II, because there's actually a runway on Balcony Point there. But sadly, it was demolished as a ruin in 1960s. Now, as to the ministers of this parish, the minister that wrote the OSA was the Reverend Harry Robertson, but just briefly, the minister immediately prior to him was a George Watson, and Fasty tells us that he was one of the first Presbyterian ministers to wear the pulpit gown, the long black robes that we are quite familiar with. But their locals did not like this at all, and they drove him from the parish. So in comes our hero, the Harry Robertson. Harry Robertson was the son of a minister from Kincardine, which is on the 4th of Firth. His father was a very educated person as well as being a minister, and he happened to be the tutor of Sir Harry Monroe, the fellow who was about to inherit the ruined castle. Remember him? So our young Harry Robertson was a little bit older than him, but definitely would have known the young Harry Monroe when he was a student with his father. And as well as that, Reverend Harry Robertson's grandfather worked on the Balcony estate. So very distinct connections there with KILTEARN. The Reverend Harry wrote our OSA, and he also wrote a series of evangelical discourses, and for his work he received a Doctorate of Divinity from Aberdeen University in 1802. Now, for a little bit of a laugh, I've added this picture down the corner here of, I couldn't find any pictures of the real Reverend Harry, but I found this other fellow who's also Harry Robertson. He was born in Glasgow. He became a seafarer and whaler and a folk singer in Australia. So another nice little connection there, I thought. During my research, I found so many connections with slavery that I actually had to record it. So the Reverend Harry's wife was Anne Forbes. She was the sister of the Attorney General of Barbados. And his brothers were merchants and slave owners in Tobago, Grenada and Demerara. And all 7 of Robertson's surviving children and many of his grandchildren were connected with plantations and slavery in Demerara or Berbice, Grenada. His son Gilbert operated a sugar plantation with 83 slaves, and he named it KILTEARN. And as you can see from the slide, Alexander Fraser, who was a plantation owner also in South America, bought the Balcony Castle with the money he gained from his slave laboured plantations, and he built the village of Everton and the woods, etc. By far the most fascinating minister of KILTEARN was 100 years earlier, but his memory lives on very long. It's still there today. He was a 17th century Covenanter, and he was a minister of KILTEARN until the restoration of Charles II, when he was very quickly replaced by an Episcopal minister. Now, our Reverend Thomas was not going to take this lying down, so he continued to preach all over Scotland and was incarcerated numerous times. So we have here on this thing here lots of places that he was locked up. Finally, he decided that he better go, so he fled to Holland, and luck would have it, he became the chaplain for the Prince William of Orange. Now, Prince William of Orange, as you probably know, became King William with his wife Mary, William and Mary. So when they were returned, and King James was taken off the crown, the English throne, he returned to KILTEARN, as he'd predicted many years before that he would return to KILTEARN and would be buried there at the church. And that's exactly what happened. He's returned to KILTEARN and he's buried at the east door of the church. And whether he asked for it or somebody else did, they put this stone right where he was buried, and it says, this right at the doorway, remember, this stone shall bear witness against the parishioners of KILTEARN if they bring any ungodly minister in here. So long after his death, he can still threaten. Now, down by the shoreline is the old church. It's sadly in ruins today, but it's still there in ruins. It had been used by the Monroe families for centuries, and at the time of our OSA, it was actually being rebuilt and refurbished by Sir Harry and then Sir Hugh for £700. It still has the original buttresses and a drip mould from an arched window visible in the east gable, and it seated 700 people, which is a pretty big church. They replaced the thatch with slate at that point, and it was T-shaped with two elegant staircases leading to a panelled loft for the three Monroe families to sit above. So the Thordale, the Fowles and the Balcony families sat up in the upper area looking down on the plebs, I presume. It wasn't actually replaced until 1953 when they built a new church in Everton. And a lot of the work for building that church was actually by Jack McLennan, another relative. Not sure how direct, but he's a McLennan. There was a comment in the local paper that they found it amazing that the Presbyterians could no longer walk all the way down to the shore. They had to have a local church. This is the same church, an earlier picture of it, but that line there is confusing because that's actually the mountain behind it, so the church ends there. The ancient burial ground sits right beside the church, so you can see the church here and the burial ground, but it's above the firth, so a very nice place to be laid, I think, really, isn't it? Slope up to the grass. This is a single tabletop tomb, and here we have a double one for a married couple. Robert Moore Monroe was the first Fowles to be buried here in 1588, as I said earlier. Before then, they were all buried in the Channery on Murray Firth, and it's still used today, this burial grounds. And this is the site of the old Church of Scotland manse. The new one's now in Everton. This building is actually Victorian. It was built in 1894, but it replaced the manse that had been built in 1762, in which the Reverend Harry lived. And he complains that it was built very cheaply and it was in dire need of repairs. But I don't know if they ever actually did it, because this place here is built 130 years later. So maybe he didn't get his wish. At the time when he had his place, there was outbuildings and a large orchard, and it's a gorgeous spot there down by the water, isn't it? The people of KILTEARN. Now we have 6 landowners, 2 of them living full time. 60 years earlier, there were twice as many landowners, but they'd been reabsorbed into the large estates, which is probably an indicator, because they had to sell them. They sold them to the large landowners, probably an indicator that the land was not productive enough to survive on those smaller estates. There's also 78 principal farmers, and they employed day labourers, and they sublet approximately 10-acre lots to the tenant farmers. The minister says these are the ones that are the very poor land managers and shouldn't really call themselves farmers at all. He also talks about the cotters or mailers, which we've talked about in other talks, that lived on 1 or 2 acres, and he says they manage their small plots very well, but they need to do additional work. Now, I've listed here the additional work that these artificers, mechanics and day labourers did. So we have 3 blacksmiths, 8 tailors, we have 14 masons and slaters because of all the building work happening. We have 9 shoemakers, I presume because everybody's walking everywhere. The joiners and coopers are making, there's 8 of them. Now, if the distilleries, everything's being drunk at it, it's interesting that they have so many. Only 3 millers because there's not much product there. 4 cartwrights to repair the carts. Only 4 shopkeepers because Drummond only had 2 little shops there. 6 weavers, 36 apprentices. Now, we've talked at length in other talks about this, that whether they're apprenticed to all these people or whether there's many more of them are only temporarily there because they're apprenticed to the masons and slaters. Not sure. Only 1 dyer and 1 bleacher for that bleach field. And they managed their small acreage well, and they planted potatoes as their staple, and they maintained their day jobs as well. But there was not enough work within Kiltearn, so they actually had to go further afield. And the picture there is actually a modern day picture of someone walking along Kiltearn Beach. The rent value of the parish is £1,500, and this is rented out at between £10 and £80 per annum, depending on the type of soil and the size of it. Wages vary depending on the employer, so you could get £3 yearly plus some meal and potatoes, or the right to plant the potatoes. But if you were a really good ploughman, you could earn twice as much. You could get £6, isn't bad. The female servants there have got £1 4 shillings a year, but they also were fed in the house where they worked, so it's slightly more than that. They'd taken up recently doing a payment of 6p a day for day labour, and that was not popular at all, because if you were getting piecework pay, you could work harder and earn a lot more. I said that the building work was available during this area because there's lots of stone and timber and lots of rebuilding happening. Now, the minister talks about the hard years of 1782 to 83. It seems that there was actually a massive grain shortage at that point. And so he comments that it was really good that there was all the rebuilding happening at the time, because it meant that there was actually work for people at the time of poor harvest. He decries that there's very little work for women and children, and there's a need for manufacturing. I wonder whether he actually wanted those coal mines to open to send the kids down. Once again, this is the grain store here. There's many desperate poor, and the minister, I have enormous respect for him, because he really considers the people very greatly, and he says that it's the same all over Scotland, or particularly in the Highlands, that there are so many poor that there's such very little way of actually looking after them, and so they have to travel from town to town and village to village to try and beg, or they will starve to death. He says there's 100 on their poor list, but they only get £10 in church collections, which is not very much to go around per annum, is it? Many resort to begging, as he said. The wages had barely increased, but the costs had doubled in 30 years. So a cow that was £1 16 shillings is now £3, and a cheese that was 2 and 4p is now 4 shillings or 5 shillings. Peat was used for fires and lighting because candles were too expensive. So this is our relatives having to light the house with peat. Lovely. There was some, I've said about the day labourers. Now the mealwright. Bruce used this as part of his advertising. Now, the memories obviously of the 1782 to 83 grain shortage was very fresh in their minds in 1796 when it was happening again. And the locals were no longer going to put up with this. So this grain store here is full of grain ready to be shipped out, and they decided they would do something about it. So hundreds marched behind a piper, including local volunteer militia all the way from Dingwall to foul storehouse to prevent the shipment of this much needed grain. Apparently they weren't successful. So protesting in those days was not much more successful than it seems to be today. The landowners were still demanding rent. They were demanding much higher rent. Now, previously what had happened was you had low rent and in return, you did work on the farm of the landowner. So you got peat for him and you plowed his fields and things. But in recent times, the rents had been rising, but the minister says the amount of work was still as great. So these people who were having to pay high rents were still having to give a huge amount of free time to the landlord and not be able to work their own farms. And so they were actually getting into dire poverty and debt because of this setup. And I think it's interesting that he's actually quite happy to actually say that, because after all, it's the landlord that actually pays him, isn't it, too? So it's interesting that he feels free to do that. He must have felt very secure in his position. The increase in crime lately, these blind whiskey houses were causing people to commit robberies, he says, because the blind whiskey people would accept anything when the people ran out of cash. So they'd be stealing grain and clothing and furniture even to pay for their grog. The minister, as we saw, was a highly educated person, and so was Sir Harry Munro. And so this seems to reflect in what's happening in the educational standards of the district. And he comments a few country parishes are favoured with similar advantages for educating their youths. In 1717, the first school opened at Drummond, and it was built and paid for by the landowners, George Munro at the time. By 1792, there were 60 to 80 children attending the school. Now, I was interested that he actually, and I went back and read the OSA again, he says children. So I presume it's of both sexes, because he probably would have just said youths if it was boys. And they taught a wide range of subjects, and the money was raised from the heritors, but students also paid by the quarter for specific subjects. So English for $1 and writing 1 6d, and arithmetic 2 shillings. I think we used to call that 2 bob in the day. Latin was 2 6. They also taught useful sciences, French, geography, geometry, bookkeeping, and practical maths. And this is what he says is really unusual for a country parish, to have this wide variety of subject areas. He says the pupils carried peat to school for the fire. And by 1837, there was a John McLennan, and they believe that it's misspelled, but was the master there. The picture here is actually in Lair, which is actually within Kiltearn. So it's not the Drummond school, but the schoolhouse was this end bit here. And it says that the toilets were in the woods behind, and there was a water well nearby. But Australians call them long drops, those toilets, just digging a hole. And if the well's too close, it would pollute it. So interesting. Place names. I won't start with, I'll start with the language first, sorry. The most commonly spoken language is Gaelic or Erse. But lately English is taking over. And he comments, and I didn't realise this either, but he says in most of the country, Gaelic is preached in the morning and the English in the afternoon. So the ministers clearly had to be bilingual, didn't they? He comments that the place languages, place names are also Gaelic based. So balcony means a dwelling place, and but somebody else, Watson, says that it actually means bale, or as in strong. In 1801, there's 1,500 people living in Kiltearn. By 1881, so we're talking nearly 100 years later, there's only 1,100, but there's still more than half still Gaelic speaking. So clearly the Gaelic influences are very strong in the parish. Now, this is a very damning quote. The minister says, "In no country, perhaps, are the gentlemen better lodged and the tenants worse accommodated than in this parish. The greatest number of dwellings are built of earth and are usually razed to the ground once in 5 or 7 years, when they are usefully added to the dunghill." Now, I found that interesting because as Bruce and Don, my great-great-grandmother was probably living in one of these little places that were razed to the ground regularly. In perfect contrast to miserable huts called shearlings was where the Lairds live. So here's the castle. here's the shearling, and here's a better style of smoke. Now, he comments that there's 385 smokes or houses in the KILTEARN Parish, but of those, only 40 are actually habitable. And because there's such a shortage, even though they're absolute hovels, if there's 5 or 6 people waiting to take over whenever any of them were vacated, and there's absolutely no incentive to improve the dwellings because work was so impermanent that why would you? So the women and the children lived in this style of house. This one's down by a firth, obviously, but up in the hills during the summer, looking after the animals, and the men went back to the houses. Here we have, this is to indicate the change that's about to happen, because as I've said, Everton is about to be built. So this is a shearling, his mum milking the cow up in the hills. Definitely a very poor hovel, but very soon this style of house was being built in Everton, so big changes. Now, I was very excited to discover that a girlfriend of mine in Sydney actually grew up in KILTEARN, and this is it. This is Milton of Capewell, where she grew up, and her nephew is there still today. Nice connection. Now, I know you'll all be very, very surprised, but he comments that infectious diseases spread rapidly, and that once it's in a family, it keeps on spreading very rapidly. And he says that smallpox reappears every 7 years, and in 77 to 78, there were more than 47 children died of smallpox. And he says this is because the lower ranks were reluctant to inoculate. Hard to believe, isn't it? You can open your mic if you want to comment on that one. Apparently the upper echelons were actually inoculating their kids, and the lower ones didn't believe in it. He also comments another one that in 1782, the grain crisis impaired their constitutions and caused chronic illness, which is probably real. The next one I'm not so sure about. He says rheumatic fever was caused by the new linen shirts instead of the woolen flannel that they'd always traditionally worn. He sadly comments that there's no midwives at all in the district, and so there's a great loss of life for women and children due to this. Now, as to clothes, how the women spun their own clothes. Now, they didn't have spinning wheels because they couldn't afford them, and so they had these drop spindles, which are fabulous things. Now, one of the other speakers referred to them as well, that it meant that the women could mind the children, cook, do all sorts of other things, as well as spinning. It's a pretty full-time job. I was at a Celtic festival in New South Wales recently, and there were some spinners there, and I was talking to them about it, and they grabbed a spindle and showed me how to use it. I didn't get to use it, but I saw them doing it. Tartan was no longer forbidden. It had been after Culloden, but it's no longer forbidden. But apparently the men dressed as lowlanders rather than as Highlanders in these days, so trews instead of kilts. I found it interesting that it was the Vikings that introduced eating seafood and smoking food in the 8th century, and they also introduced oats. You wonder what they thought seafood was for before then. But, oats, even though they'd been introduced 1,000 years earlier, they weren't commonly used until the 18th century. So the century we're talking about. Oats and milk and local veg were their main staple. So this is our relatives would have been eating this sort of food, along with potatoes for the very poorest. So they ate soups and stews and broths of mainly vegetable, and they very rarely had a hen in the pot. They had easy access to locally caught and grown foods, but that would have been very seasonal and dependent on the landlord's whims as well. Swedes were for locals and turnips were for the wealthy. Now, the wealthy would have been eating significantly more meat, but as this Edward Burt on the slide says, he comments that they're eating basically butter and cheese, oatmeal, kale and roots dressed in different ways. But he's saying that's probably a better diet than the southern neighbours who were eating more processed foods with sugar in it. It's an interesting concept because we did have someone who lived to 117, didn't we? The quote at the top there is from the lady who did the research on the food for the Outlander program, and I think it's very good. She says the food was either terribly bad or terribly good. It had either been salted or preserved in lard, half rancid, or it was fresh. I think that says it all. I think our early McLennans in this parish, or most of the Highlands, ate like that. Bruce.
Okay, thanks, Helen, for that let's look at the McLennans in this parish in this period. You can see there a list of the sort of numbers that we see, quite a few. And of course, this is incomplete because of the incomplete records that we know existed there at that time. One fellow who's of curious interest here, born quite early on, we get from the Fasti as the main source. You know, that's the Succession of the Ministers book that you've been referred to in each of these sessions. He's called Reverend Murdoch McLennan. He was born in Drummond in 1702. It's a really early birth for our record keeping. I do want to make the point, though, that usually when you find someone like this, you know, and he was married, we really, unless the Fasti tell us about his children, there really aren't, there hardly ever are any records that allow us to follow through any children and move on to their next generations the way we would in a couple of hundred years later. So this fellow, Reverend Murdoch McLennan, born in 1702, he was very well educated, and you know, you can go there and look at his page and see a lot more about him. He finished up living over on Aberdeenshire, you know, in the really an unlikely place for McLennans, near where Balmoral Castle, you know, the castle that was greatly developed by Queen Victoria's husband, consort, Albert, was quite taken by the Highlands and encouraged Victoria to take more interest and be more supportive of Scots. And over there was where this fellow lived. But in the meantime, he'd written a poem, which is his main claim to fame, it would seem. And the poem is about the Battle of Sheriff Muir, which was a battle in the first Jacobite Rising, as it's called, the 1715 battle, events rising, which of course isn't really the first, you know that, because of the Battle of Glen Shield, you know, that had taken place earlier there on the Jacobite claim. But this was the first rising, it's called. And he wrote, and the Battle of Sheriffmuir was down near Dunblane, down that way, just north of Stirling there. And although the numbers on the Jacobite side were quite significant, I think about 14,000, as opposed to the Royalist side, about 4,000 only, and the Jacobites had the advantage in the battle, they failed to take the opportunity and close it out. You know, they let the enemy get away and lost a lot of momentum because of that, and motivation. And really, in that sort of sense of not being a victory, but being not a success either, they lost a lot of momentum for their cause. In the meantime, James, you know, the claimant to the throne, that many in England as well as Scotland wanted to see come back, had landed in Scotland, ready to take on the job. You know, here I am ready. But as a result of this battle, which was neither won nor lost, this fellow wrote the poem, this minister here, and I'll just read you a little bit of it. It says, "There's some that say we won," W-A-N, he spells one, and some say that they won, and some say that none won at a man. But a thing is sure, that at Sheriffmuir a battle there was that I saw, man. And we ran, and they ran, and they ran, and we ran, and we ran, and they ran away, man. And that's how it goes on like that. We ran, and they ran. That's his poem. You can read this there by looking up him. He's not too hard to find because he's born in Kilturn in 1702. You'll find him quite easily. Next slide, Helen.
You didn't talk about the births and the...
What?
The births, 11 births.
Yeah, I said they're, you know, they're incomplete, and
okay,
you know, that's the sort of numbers we see. They're not unusual. So we can also see in our database the sort of occupations people had, which I know is relevant and interesting to you. You know, there were gardeners in our database and a servant, and you know this term flesher, don't you? That is used quite widely for people who we would otherwise call butchers. Flesher, like the German word Fleischer. and farm labourers and crofters and shoemakers. We saw a lot of those, so we'd expect to see some of those in farmers. Now, this, of course, is the cover of my book about our great Helen and my brother's great grandfather, whose mother was from this parish, from Clare, along there in the lower area. And of course, I also have another connection with this parish. That is that my wife's this is our great grandmother, but my wife's great grandfather was born in that balcony castle. His family had lived in Tasmania and came back to rent Balcony Castle for a short time when he was born there in the mid 1800s. And his middle names are Ross and Munro. Prue's sister's got Munro as a middle name. You know, this is all pretty close, isn't it, when you start seeing the names come through like that, because of the sort of significant, sort of pay homage, you know. Okay, yeah, so thank you, Helen. Let's look now at the, just a bit of a list here of some of the people who were born and married there. An interesting thing, in preparation for this talk, I looked at the marriages and I saw this one here that just had an M. You see halfway down where Helen's pointing the pointer? It's just got M for McLennan. I suspect it's Mary because of what I saw later, but she's married someone called Donald Ross. You know, there are millions of, there are more of them than there are John McLennans, let me tell you that. And M, so I bought the marriage record for her yesterday, and it turned out that she was a domestic servant in Fowles Castle on the marriage record. So that's the sort of thing, you know, if you're researching people and you've got a bit of a feel for what that might mean, and you see it on the marriage record, as I did when I bought that one, by understanding a bit about the places and the names and so on there, then you can get a bit of, you know, oh yeah, I see, that's what she's working. You can know the name, and if it's not too clear to read, you can make it out. I think we all know the benefit in that, in knowing a bit about the place and learning a bit about the place. But I haven't yet found her, of course. You know, she's married in 1808, so there's a good chance you won't find that person ever again. A bit like I said about the minister and his, you know, being born so long ago. And there on the other side, we've got a list of the births in that earlier time, and mostly earlier time. And they're the first one of the earliest McLennan we have born in that parish is that minister, Reverend Murdoch McLennan in 1702. But I'd like you to see that next one there. Look, you see, that's a girl, that name, Grizzle. Do you know that name, Grizzle? It's quite a good name. It's spelled all sorts of ways, sometimes with a double S, sometimes with a double L. But that's the more common spelling, G-R-I-Z-E-L, Grizzle. Be a good name to call one of your children, wouldn't it? Maybe not. But in later years, these people who, like you see with Christian over on the other side, you've got a Christian McLennan there marrying a John Mackenzie. You know, that sort of name, Christian, that's a girl's name in Scotland. And you would expect that in later life, she'd be called either Christy with a Y probably, or maybe with an IE, or Christina even later. Probably she goes through, you know, she might be born as Christian, married as Christy, and die as Christina. That's a sort of typical pattern for that name of a girl. Grizzle, the great name Grizzle.
I found this one interesting because it's a Helen who became Helen McLennan, married to a Donald McLennan. Now, I have a brother, Donald McLennan, and I'm Helen McLennan.
That's it. But anyway, Grizzle in later years would be known more likely than not as Grace. That's the name. It didn't last very long, the name Grizzle. I guess it's a Gaelic name. Yeah. So now this is the usual chart that we see. It shows us where this parish ranks among the others, and I think it's 20 something, but it's quite close to a lot of other ones we've looked at. You can see over there, this is the second page of names. See 2 of 4 there, the bottom right-hand corner. And you can see some of the other parishes that we've looked at, can't you? There, Locks we looked at the other day, Tane we looked at earlier this year, Allness we looked at last year, all, you know, familiar places there. We're looking at Kiltearn today. So, you know, we've got quite a lot of those there. Glen Shield we've got in preparation. Uig, we're going to deal with that later too. Urquhart and Logie Wester, we have that in preparation. Yeah, so they're places that you'll come to know better as you work through these meetings. But this particular one has 15. To my mind, it's a bit surprising even that there are that many, because it's so anti-Mackenzie, this parish. Yeah, particularly they talk about the Jacobites and the Mackenzies in the same breath. The Mackenzie Jacobites, they call them. It's a sort of pocket of, resistance to the Mackenzie takeover. It's okay. Yeah, so, there's these charts, by the way, if you haven't yet accessed them, they're available from the dark left-hand menu on the genealogy page. You don't even need to be a member to get those things. And they're generated dynamically. These pie charts are dynamically generated when you ask for when you put the request in for that one to be done, and it comes off the live data as at that moment. So if I added another birth to Kiltearn, as might happen, you would find that it would show 16 there straight away. It's not a static chart. It's developed and takes a little while to produce sometimes. Because it's not dynamic. It's not static. Yeah, thanks, Helen.
Okay, I found it very interesting going from what Bruce pointed me towards, the data in the clan collection, and reading the stories of the various people and how much there was of cross-fertilisation basically across. So here's Kiltearn here, our Italian-looking place. Here's Allness. Now, our Catherine Mackay was born there in Clare, and Donald McLennan that she married was born here. And he was a flesher, wasn't he, Bruce?
Yeah.
And they married, and they sorry.
And his father.
And his father, and they then they were married in Inverness, and they ended up in Bewley, and then of course their children scattered all over the world, some to Canada, some to Australia, to New Zealand, then Australia. We had interesting ones of how much upward mobility there was, because we had people born in Kiltearn, moved to Compton, born in Compton, moved to Kiltearn, started off as farm labourers, end up with a sizable farm, 30-acre farms. So even though they appear to be reasonably lowly, I think there was significant chance of improvement. And I think our great-grandfather was a prime example of that, he ends up becoming a moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Australia from very, very basic roots of these two little people who were born in Allness and Kiltearn. I was saying there's a lot of walking going on. Well, people were trotting down to Kintail, over to Applecross, Gairloch, lots of people going everywhere. So they were very interconnected. So I think it's wrong to think that because they didn't have lots of transport and trains and things, that they weren't actually moving about. And
one of the reasons they moved was that the Lairds owned estates in different parishes. What we're seeing, the next meeting is about Loch Broom. You can point that out, Helen, there. It's a very big parish on the top right there. Yeah. And the main heritor there, the main estate owner there, is from Cromarty, on the tip of the Black Isle there, and they've got estates all over the place, and they move labour around sometimes. Mackenzie was particularly known for that. So they'd move people from their estates in Compton to the estates in Kintail and so on.
I found it interesting that Sandy last night was saying that he knew that people went to South America to work on the plantations as labourers and craftsmen and things, not necessarily the plantation owners. So they were also travelling overseas and coming back again. So I guess they were bringing ideas from all over the place.
Yeah, and masons, you see that sometimes people go to New England in North America, that New England, to be masons in certain time, in the season, and then they come back.
Curiosities. The Reverend Robertson, as I said, he's not concise in his language, but he's very eloquent. He was very excited about the curiosities of this parish, and there's pages and pages of descriptions, and the main one that he's very pleased about is this thing called Black Rock Gorge. Now, I showed you where Black Rock Gorge was on the Alt Garard River, right up on the Allness boundary, and it's a 36-metre long gorge, and apparently it becomes very, very narrow. And for 900 metres, the water rushes through where it whirls and foams, these are his words, with great fury, and shoots up and darts with the swiftness of an arrow. So he goes on and on, but I just gave you an example to show you how beautifully he described it. So it's a 36-metre deep gorge. That's quite significant. It's still very popular today with picnickers, and even in his day it was, and people used to even try and jump bits of it, and they laid logs across there, and the very brave, he says, were rewarded for their bravery by standing and looking down into the gorge from these very rickety bridges that people were building. Craziness. The most interesting thing, though, is that this is where the story of the Lady of Balcony is actually cited. Now, the Lady of Balcony was from her very early years was famous for her extra skills that she had. With her hand, she could raise the castle and lower the castle back down again. Maybe that's why it was ruined by the 1960s. She kept raising it up. One day, the story goes that she left the castle and she headed to the gorge, and her maid followed to see where her mistress was going. And she witnessed her jumping into this gorge. Remember, it's 36 metres deep. The maid calls out, "Madam, madam," and the Lady of Balcony throws the keys to the castle up, and they hit the edge of the gorge here. And you can still today see the marks of where the keys are on the edge. And if you're very, very lucky, you might even hear or smell her cooking for the devil. Terrific story. I think it's what attracts the picnickers. It was also used when they were filming the Harry Potter Goblet of Fire for the dragon race. And if you go to that YouTube that I've got on there, there's some wonderful images of this gorge here. So it looks fantastic. The minister's also terribly excited about the prehistory of the area, the Ice Age evidence. And he says, I actually hadn't mentioned Frank McLennan has written a series of papers called the Ferndonald Papers about Kiltearn and Allness, and he tells you a lot about the early 20th century, but it also reflects back to the past, and he's a significant source of information if you need to know any more. You can get it at the Ross and Cromarty Heritage Centre online. And so he talks that even in the early 20th century, there's still evidence of these Orkney Cromarty style chambered cairns. So they would have had a roof over the top of them. This one's actually in Orkney, but at the time of the OSA, there was still significant evidence of these in Kiltearn. He also talks about lots of evidence of these cup markings on rocks, and no one so far has been able to tell me what they're actually for. No one seems to know. I've done a lot of digging. If any of you know, please tell me. There's also a lot of remains of standing stones and ancient stone circles can be found at the Moor of Clyne. And it's called Clyne because it's on an incline, and at Black Hill, which is also clearly next to Black Rock. All this is clear evidence of the first inhabitants. But as I said, he has pages and pages of descriptions of this, absolute details of the standing stones with their measurements, and he's drawn pictures of them. And the OSA actually says that they were unable, I think they couldn't afford to actually get the etcher to actually etch it so they could print it. Right, can you please open your mics up? Because I'd like anyone to have any comments about, from what you've learned and comparing it with some of the other speeches, what the advantages and disadvantages are of the Kiltearn Parish. Any ideas? Kathy, you know, you've done a lot of work.
Well, where's Kathy? Oh, there she is.
Yes.
I'm just I was kind of surprised about the way it seems like transportation was important, so meaning that there was a lot of flow of goods, even though they didn't do a lot of farming for, resale, but that it seemed like they had access to a lot of things, or, and again, they were on the coast of the Firth there. So they had access to seafood. I was just super impressed about the school. You know,
Yes.
I mean, that's such an
Yeah.
advantage for the children. And amazing how many extra subjects that they could take part in. I mean, just so different from what we heard on the other side in the Western Highlands. Very different.
I think as a teacher, I'm very impressed, because I've always believed that if you raise expectations, people reach it, and that very much
Exactly.
that they were doing that, weren't they?
Yeah, giving them the opportunity, and just yeah, it's great.
I've never seen a part of Scotland that we've heard of that is so different. I mean, I just am having trouble wrapping my brain around that my poor relatives came from where they did. It's just, I mean, when my great grandfather, I guess Kathy's mom, came to Canada, they couldn't read and write, much less their opportunities were, they didn't speak English either. But just the topography, the advanced animal husbandry, education, as you said, and then the interesting differential between the haves and the have-nots. That was, I think, more poignant than in Western Scotland to me.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just, wow, it's a total difference. And yeah, I found no similarities and felt really badly for my relatives.
I guess a lot of them were able to work in the
And
castle.
I thought it was really interesting. Oh,
Well, we lost you, Kathy.
I just thought it was interesting. Oh, can you hear me now?
Sometimes.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay. I thought it was interesting too, when Helen was talking about, you know, smallpox and how there was such a resistance, which again is so different from the Western Highlands seemed to be much more accepting of that and going forward with that. And you would think that the Heritors or the Monroes, those folks would insist if people were kind of working on their land and working in the castles and that kind of thing. So
no compulsion for a vaccination, apparently.
Yeah.
I think one thing we're seeing in so many of these places is that money is coming in from outside, from one way or another. You know, that they've got interests outside that, in particular, you know, this one benefited soon after by the money that the owner of the plantations in the Caribbean, let's say, Caribbean, had been paid when the slaves were released. You know, that was how he got the money from the payment for, they made a payment in Britain for buying out the slaves. And he used that to build, you know, that Everton and so on. You know, this is it's external income that is artificially, you might say, propping up the parish. And when that runs out, they you know, run out of opportunities. The building works and the new towns and the new industries that are being tried and so on, they peter out. We see that a lot.
Quite obscene, though, isn't it, that the landlords can spend so much money on their castle and their church, and quite clearly witnessing their employees living in desperate poverty.
Right.
One thing go ahead.
Sorry, go on. No, the other interesting thing that they would have been able to collect money was from the bleaching of all that cloth. They probably were they're probably selling that to maybe other parishes. If they were bleaching that amount of linen, it was obviously like a home industry, perhaps.
No, because it was actually owned by the Monroes. They were actually employing the bleacher. So he didn't own it. They were actually paying for it, and they paid for his house. And and he simply ran it for them. So no, they were getting the profit.
Oh,
There would have been work,
oh,
work for people.
Yeah, sure.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what manufacturing is. Has to
Yeah.
be owned by somebody, and that's a competitive market for bleached cloth. But there was very little flax grown in the parish, very tiny amount. These areas we're talking about compared to farms that we know, they're so small, aren't they? You look at the total, it looks like they're growing a lot of stuff and everything, but actually the area is probably what we would call today less than one farm.
These days also, if you were bleaching cloth, you would then have the next industry of making clothes, wouldn't you? Whereas that they didn't go that next step. And I guess by Victorian times that people did, but they didn't in 1790s.
One thing we see a lot here is this warrior culture, that they're not only fighting all sorts of wars that they can do to support the royals, but they're even hiring out mercenaries to other countries from this parish. It's a bit more aggressive than you might have seen elsewhere. How does that affect the life of ordinary people? Dramatically. Lots of, people dying in battles overseas and whatnot.
And also being exposed to life overseas and maybe moving over there too, I guess.
Maybe, yeah. And of course, that's a source of earning some income to be a soldier.
Sure.
So
That's
that's
one of the few sources, yeah.
Another way they're bringing money back, particularly being a mercenary soldier, the laird and the soldiers are earning income. I don't think many moved to Sweden. Didn't you say that? You thought that was a possibility though, Peter? There you go.
Tell you what, Sweden.
There, some of the Munro mercenaries went to Sweden from here.
Ah, I didn't know that, but yeah.
I think Sweden had quite a few battles, at this sort of time with the Russians and various others. And of course, you've got the distillery, it must have employed a few people as well as the bleach works. These are the sort of things that I think were envisaged when he talks about manufacturing. We hear a lot about if only manufacturing was introduced, and it makes you wonder what they have in mind when they're talking about manufacturing. I don't think they're talking about assembling computers or anything.
Yeah, I think the minister was very worldly wise, and he's looked further around in the world and said, look, other people are using the coal or doing this or doing that, and like the manufacturing. And so he's frustrated that this Kiltearn area is not actually embracing modern ideas and moving forward. That's the impression I got from him.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I have one other question, and this could be for anybody who's done a presentation. Looking at the cemeteries, it's really a two-part question, and with minimal religious resources in many of these places, but how do they possibly afford these stones? I mean, they're the engraving, the transportation, the burial. How's this done?
I think it's fair to say, Catherine, that there are a lot of burials that do not have stones in the 1700s and the early, and even the early to mid and even late 1800s. No stone. They just buried them and that was that. Maybe some temporary marker and that just rotted away. A lot of people buried without headstones. It's a more recent thing to have often and mostly headstones, maybe even since 1900, that sort of date. In these times, there are very few. Couldn't afford them.
Well, that's what I'm asking, because so many of my relatives in the La Colche or my great-great-grandmother, they couldn't afford one on Harris, but I can't even believe she's buried there. But I mean, some of them that we can go back are very, very old, and these people are very, very poor. I just don't quite get it. Unless, I suppose the question is, was it sponsored by the church? Did they do the headstones?
I don't think so.
Maybe that's why a lot of the headstones carry the whole family line. So you only had one stone that represented several families, eh?
That's very thought. Yeah.
That's a really good idea.
Maybe
I
actually
know,
some of
yeah. Because some of
maybe
the
Masons-
McLennans I saw, like it was put on laterally, but it, you know, it included the predecessor sort of thing. But
Yeah.
the stones were put up in memory of. So maybe as people had more money, then they did put up the stones.
Good point.
Christine, did you have something to say?
I was just wondering, there were always quite a few Masons in the parish, so maybe they did it in like for goods or for something else. Perhaps they would do the stone and they were paid in kind and not for money, perhaps.
Mm. Yeah.
Maybe.
That makes some
Okay.
sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have to leave to babysit. So thank you, Helen. Thank you very much.
Thank
I'm
you.
off.
Now let's just look at,
Thank you.
nice to see you, Christine. Let's just look at the objectives
Hi,
that we
Thank
had. And
you.
Helen's going to talk about these, aren't you,
Yeah.
Helen? But
Yeah.
we just to mention these Fern Donald papers that are the picture here. This fellow who wrote them, Frank McLennan, he's actually called Alex, not Alexander, but Alex Francis McLennan. But if you Google someone born in Kiltearn called Frank, you'll get that because it's in there as his nickname. And they're really quite comprehensive and probably the most quoted source of information about everyday life in this parish is this bunch of papers that were, you know, a collection of his writings. They're partly yarns and they're not necessarily very academic and reference to sources, but more about stories that he's heard about things that happened and so on. So, you know, you need to probably support it with some other more authoritative reference, but it's a really widely quoted source. So to find out where these papers are, you can just Google him, not Google him, look him up in our clan databases, Frank McLennan, born in Kiltearn, you'll find him. Over to Helen.
So yes, as Bruce said, the Fair & Donald papers was a significant source. The Ross and Cromarty history.org is a fantastic site because it's got lots of visuals as well as data, and it leads off and heads you in onto lots of other channels. So you could spend your life actually just following that. I found Fasti very interesting as well because of the detail they had. But I also found it very interesting looking at the clan data thing because I found specific information about our relatives. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the topography and the location of it because it looks like it's a blessed position, doesn't it? It's a beautiful site and it's got the mountain and the sea, so you've got the full range of land. In fact, I kept comparing it with the Cook Islands, which we'd been to, and every little property in the Cook Islands goes from the mountain down through the cultivating land to the sea, much smaller, but exactly the same principle as this one. I also found it very interesting how educated the minister was, and so he was able to give me so much data. So that OSA, I read and read and read, and it's terrific. And every time I read it, I get another little nuance from it that I go, oh, now I understand that, because I'd gone off and researched the years of the fish things. The first time I read it, I had no idea what a year was, so I just ignored it. So it's really worth going back to primary source constantly, as everybody knows. The health and the housing he talked about significantly, didn't talk about diet much at all, so I had to do other research there. But the housing he was absolutely scathing about. So I hope you enjoyed it, because I thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity of actually living since last October in Kiltearn. I broke my ankle in November, so I had a wonderful way of just sitting and researching because I couldn't do much else. And I really enjoyed learning where my great-great-grandmother had come from. So I have to thank Bruce for pointing me in that direction. Thanks, Bruce, and thank you everybody for listening.